The soup had already left her hands. That was the part that would not leave her. Not the words she had heard through the stillness of the passage, not the careful, unhurried voice of Mr. Danner. Oldwick Pembridge saying that a man of the Baron's constitution would not survive a second dose. Not even the cold deliberateness of it, the way the word dose had landed as though he were discussing a recipe for game pie. What would not leave her was the moment she had set the tureen on the sideboard, outside the dining room door, and felt her fingers go entirely numb, and understood that the soup was already inside. She was Nora Doyle. Why? She had been cook at Ashbourne Park for 11 years. She had fed 3 generations of guests at that table, had maintained the kitchen through 2 changes of housekeeper, had never once been summoned to the front of the house for any reason other than to receive a compliment about the pastry. She had no standing to speak of, no letter of introduction to any magistrate, no uncle with a commission. What she had was a pair of capable hands, a thorough knowledge of the larder, and the near-certain conviction that the Baron of Ashbourne was going to die at his own table, if someone did not tell him why. She told him. The room had not believed her. She had known they would not. She had known it, even as she stood in the doorway of the dining room, in her apron, with flour still faintly on her left cuff, and said that she needed to speak to his lordship at once, that it concerned his safety, that she would not be moved. She had watched the faces turn, Lady Pembridge's expression going narrow and flat, Mr. Pembridge going still in a way that was different from surprised, the 3 dinner guests cycling between embarrassed and amused. She had heard the first footman say quietly that she ought to go below, that this was not the done thing, that if she had a concern, she ought to bring it to the housekeeper. She had remained where she was. The Baron of Ashbourne had looked at her from the head of the table with the same grey gaze he brought to every problem placed before him, and he had said, "Let her speak." His name was Edmund Harcastle. The Baron Ashbourne. He was 34 years old, and had held the title for 6 years, since his father's death from a fever that had swept through the county in the winter of 1812. He was not a warm man, in the way that fireplaces were not warm when they were not lit. The structure of warmth was present, the capacity apparent, but the room had not yet reached the right temperature to draw it out. The county knew him as capable, fair in his dealings with tenants, and entirely indifferent to the season's more elaborate social machinery. He had come home from London 2 weeks prior with his late wife's younger brother, Mr. Bury, and a blank. Aldwick Pembridge, whom he kept close in the way. Men kept close the last living remnant of someone they had lost. He had looked at Nora Doyle, in her apron and her flower, and he had said, "Let her speak." She had spoken. She had told him everything plainly, the passage, the voice, the words, second dose. She had not embellished, she had not exclaimed. She had stood on the good stone floor of her kitchen years and spoken as clearly as she could in a dining room that smelled of beeswax and heated silver, and watched every face in that room arrange itself against her before she had finished the second sentence. Lady Pembridge, Mr. Pembridge's mother, arrived the previous day from Bath for what she had described as a restorative visit, was the first to speak when Nora had finished. She said with a kindness so calibrated it could have cut glass, that the kitchen was an exhausting place, that imagination could do peculiar things to a woman alone with her thoughts for long hours, that she was certain no harm had been intended, and that Nora ought to go below and rest. The other guests had murmured. Mr. Pembridge had said nothing at all, which was its own kind of speech. The Baron had said, "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle. Please remain within the house this evening." That was the first evening. She had cooked the breakfast herself the following morning, and had not left any dish unattended from the moment she began to the moment it reached the dumbwaiter. She did not know what she was watching for precisely. Only that she was watching. The footman noticed. The kitchen maid asked her twice if something was wrong. She said no and meant yes, and kept her hands moving because movement was the only steadiness she had. She had been cook at Ashbourne Park for 11 years. She had come at 23 from a household in the village of Croft that had dissolved when its mistress died, with a letter of character and a cold journey and a thorough terror that she would not prove adequate. She had proved adequate. She had proved more than adequate, and had spent the subsequent years becoming the kind of woman a great house could not easily replace, not because she was irreplaceable precisely, but because she had made herself necessary with the same quiet patience with which she approached everything. She knew the Baron's preference for roasted pheasant over boiled. She knew the housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, kept a small bottle of ratafia hidden in the upper cabinet of the still room for occasions of particular strain. She knew that the young maid Polly was frightened of the East Passage after dark, and that it was kinder to assign her tasks before 10 o'clock. She knew, now, that she had heard a man planning the death of another man, and that the room had looked at her and decided she was a servant in a flour-stained apron and therefore unreliable as a witness to her own ears. She had not expected the Baron to be different. She had expected to speak and to be dismissed, and she had spoken because she could not do otherwise. And the dismissal would have been easier in its way than what had actually happened, which was that he had listened. The second morning, he came to the kitchen. She was scaling fish when she heard the footstep on the stone stair, a heavier and more deliberate step than any of the kitchen staff, and looked up to find the Baron of Ashbourne standing at the entrance to her domain, with his coat properly fastened, and a look on his face that suggested he had given some thought to whether this was appropriate and had decided it was not, and had come anyway. She set down the scaling knife and wiped her hands and said, "My lord," he said, "I would like to know what you heard." "Precisely. Every word in the order. You heard it." She told him again. He listened with his arms at his sides and his gaze on the middle distance above her left shoulder, and he asked 3 questions when she had finished, each of them precise and none of them skeptical. He asked which passage. He asked whether she had seen a face. He asked whether she had heard a name. She said the East Passage, outside the wine cellar. She said she had not. She said she had heard the word second dose, and the word Baron, and the words he would not survive. He stood still for a moment in the way that she had come to understand was not blankness, but concentration. Then he said, "You have been in this household 11 years. She said, "I have, my lord." He said, "I am inclined to believe you, Mrs. Doyle." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the yard boy was moving feed across the cobbles, and the sound of it was the sound of a normal morning, and yet nothing in that moment felt entirely normal. She became aware, suddenly, of the flour on her cuff that she had not managed to fully remove, of the fish on the board, of the fact that she had no context in which to place a Baron standing in her kitchen and telling her he believed her. She said, "Thank you, my lord." He said, "Do not thank me. I want you to tell me if anything seems wrong in the kitchen, any addition to the stores you did not order, anything out of place." He paused. "Do not tell anyone I have asked you this." He left the same way he had come, and she stood for a moment with her hands very still at her sides before she returned to the fish. The household was not small. There were 14 indoor staff, and all of them had heard by the second evening that the cook had interrupted dinner to accuse someone of poisoning the Baron, and none of them had heard the caveat that the Baron had not disbelieved her. The story that circulated below stairs was the story Lady Pembridge had told at the table. An overwrought woman, alone too long, imagining voices in passages. The kitchen maid gave her a careful, worried look at breakfast and asked if she was feeling quite well. One of the footmen, a young man named Crofton, was notably less willing to meet her eyes than he had been. Nora did not argue with any of them. She had argued herself into the dining room, and that was the argument that mattered. If you find yourself wondering why she did not go to the magistrate or the constable or the vicar in the village, consider that she was a woman in a flour-stained apron with no surname to speak of, and a story about something she had heard through a closed door in a passage beside a wine cellar. Consider that she had no document, no witness, no name of the second voice. Consider that the law in 1817 was a mechanism built largely to process what gentlemen said to other gentlemen, and that a cook's word against a family member of the household in good standing was not a weight the mechanism was designed to receive. She had done the only thing available to her which was to go directly to the man in danger and tell him the truth. The third morning, she found a small cloth bag in the larder that she had not put there. It was tucked behind the earthenware pot of salted butter, on the upper shelf, half hidden by the pot's shadow. The bag was of brown linen, tied with a plain cord, and it smelled faintly of something she could not immediately name, something herbal, something not quite savory. She stood looking at it for a long moment, without touching it, then went to find the Baron. He was in the library. She had never been in a library before. She knocked at the door and was admitted by the Baron himself, who was standing at the window with a letter in his hand. And she said quietly that she had found something in the larder that she had not ordered, and that he might wish to see it. He came to the kitchen. He stood over the bag where it sat on the board. She had set it on without opening it, and he looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "Has anyone been in the kitchen this morning other than your staff?" She said that Mr. Pembridge had come down briefly at 7:30, before the kitchen maid had arrived, to request something cold be sent to his room. She said that she had been in the yard, briefly to speak to the butcher's boy, and that the kitchen had been unattended for perhaps 4 minutes. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You will not use that shelf today. I will send someone I trust to take that bag. You will tell no one." She said, "Yes, my lord." He looked at her then directly with those gray eyes that were the color of stone in overcast light, and said, "You were correct, Mrs. Doyle. 3 words." She had been cook at Ashbourne Park for 11 years, and she had fed earls and viscounts and a general whose name appeared in dispatches, and no one had ever said those 3 words to her, as though they were a weight he was placing carefully in her hands. She did not know precisely what she did with her face in that moment, but she was aware that she did not entirely manage it, and that he saw that, and that he looked away with a consideration she was not accustomed to receiving. Lady Pembridge appeared at dinner that evening wearing deep purple silk, and a smile of such absolute pleasantness that it operated as a warning. She told a story about a cook she had employed in Bath who had become convinced that the upstairs maid was stealing silver, when in fact the woman had simply been misplacing things due to a decline in her faculties. She told it with great warmth. She did not look at Nora, who was not present at dinner, but her purpose was as legible as print. Mr. Pembridge watched his mother with an expression Nora had not seen on his face before. She heard about it from the footman Crofton, who had recovered enough composure to speak to her again. He said Mr. Pembridge had been very quiet at dinner, that he had eaten little and that he had left the table early, which was unusual. On the 4th morning, Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, came to the kitchen and said, with great regret and very formal language, that Lady Pembridge had expressed a concern to her about the stability of the kitchen staff, and that she, Mrs. Graves, was obligated to convey it, though she wished to make clear that she herself had never had cause to doubt Nora's character in 11 years. Nora thanked her, and said she understood, and continued peeling the apples she had been peeling when Mrs. Graves arrived, and when Mrs. Graves had gone. She stood at the board for a long moment with the apple in one hand and the paring knife in the other, and breathed very carefully and deliberately, because she would not cry in her own kitchen. She was a woman who did not show her wounds easily. She had learned this young, in a household with a woman in distress was always given extra work as a form of comfort, as though movement were the antidote to sorrow. She had developed, over years, a practice of returning to her hands, the peel coming away from the apple in one long unbroken strip, the flour measured exact, the knife moving through a joint at the precise angle that produced the least resistance. Her hands knew what to do, even when her mind was somewhere she would rather not be. She peeled 12 apples without stopping. On the 5th morning, the Baron came to the kitchen again. He said, "The bag has been examined by a man I trust." The contents were what I suspected. She did not ask what he had suspected. She waited. He said, "I want to tell you something. I have not told anyone in this household." He told her about his wife. Not in long sentences, not with sentiment, but in the kind of compressed, careful speech that men used when they had said a thing to themselves many times, and were not sure they could say it to another person without it breaking apart in transit. His wife's name had been Clara. She had been Mr. Rowe, Pembridge's older sister, and she had died 3 years prior, of a fever that had come quickly and concluded quickly, and the physician had said it was a fever, and Edmund Hardcastle had spent 3 years believing it was a fever, and approximately 12 months ago he had begun to doubt. And the doubt had produced the particular quality of stillness that the county had interpreted as grief. He said, "Mr. Pembridge inherited nothing from his father. Clara's portion was generous, but it went to me in trust and returns to her family only if I die without issue. It is a considerable sum." He said, "I have no children." The way he said it made her understand that the absence was a wound. He had long since learned to carry inside his daily movement, so that it did not impede him but was simply always there, the way an old cut left a faint pulling sensation in cold weather. She said, "My lord, I am sorry." He said, "You were the only person in that dining room who had no reason to manage my knowledge of this." It was not a compliment, it was a precise observation. Yet, something in the way he said it made her hands go still on the board, and she did not entirely know what to do with the moment, and she found herself looking at the middle distance above his left shoulder in a way that was probably too deliberate. He said, "You are the only person in this household I currently trust." She said, "Then I will not waste it, my lord." He left. She stood in the kitchen for rather longer than was strictly necessary before resuming the morning bread. She did not tell herself stories about what it meant. She was a cook. He was a baron. The distance between those two facts was not a thing that closed merely because he had stood in her kitchen twice and told her things he had not told anyone else. She was not a foolish woman. She did not mistake the confidence of necessity for any other kind of confidence, and she returned to her bread with a thoroughness of attention that was itself a kind of argument against the alternative. But her hands remembered where they had gone still, and in the warm silence of the kitchen after the maid left that evening, she did not pretend they had not. On the 6th day the situation moved without her. Mr. Pembridge came to the kitchen himself, which was not something that had happened once in 11 years. He came at 2:30 in the afternoon, when the kitchen was quiet between preparation and the evening meal, and he stood in the doorway with a carefully pleasant expression, and said that he had something he wished to discuss with her. She said, "Yes, sir," and did not move from the work table. He said that he had been concerned naturally by her interruption at dinner, and that he understood it had placed her in a difficult position below stairs, and that he wanted her to know that he bore her no ill will for it. He said it with the manner of a man offering a gift to someone he expected to receive it with gratitude. She said, "That is very kind of you, sir." He said that he wanted to ask her, between themselves, what exactly she had heard in the passage, since the whole matter had been rather confused, and he thought a private conversation might clarify things. She said, "I believe I stated it clearly at dinner, sir." He said, still pleasantly, that sometimes in the aftermath of a startling experience, memory could become uncertain, and that he would not think less of her if she were to reflect and find that she had perhaps misheard. She looked at him for a moment. He was a pleasant-looking man, Mr. Pembridge. The kind of face that was designed to receive trust, open and well-proportioned, good in color. She had fed him at this table for 6 years. She had made the arrangements for his sister's funeral luncheon. She said, "I did not mishear, sir." Something moved behind his eyes that was not pleasant. He remained where he was for a beat longer than comfort required. And then he said pleasantly that he was sorry to hear it, and left. She relayed this conversation to the Baron that evening. She did not go to the library. She sent the footman Crofton with a note, because she had decided to trust Crofton on the basis of the particular way he had been avoiding her eyes, not with the avoidance of complicity, but with the avoidance of a young man who was frightened and did not know what to do with what he knew. She had misjudged people before, but she did not think she was misjudging him. The Baron came to the kitchen door at 9 o'clock in the evening, and she told him what Pembridge had said. He stood very still. She was beginning to understand that the stillness was not coldness, although she had initially made the same mistake as everyone else. It was the stillness of a man who thought before he moved, who had learned somewhere. possibly in grief, possibly before it. That action taken too quickly was frequently action that could not be undone. The quality of that stillness in this moment was different from the quality she had seen before. This was the stillness of something that had been held a long time and was considering its options. He said, "I am going to ask you to do something that may be uncomfortable for you." She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "I am going to ask you to continue as though nothing has changed until I tell you otherwise. I am arranging for a person from outside this household, a man, I trust, entirely, to arrive within the next 2 days. I need Pembridge to believe that I have no suspicion of him. Pain, specifically," she said. "Will you be safe in the interim?" He looked at her. It was brief, that look, and then it passed. But she had been in the business of reading faces for 11 years, and she knew what surprise looked like when it was trying to conceal itself. He said, "I will take care." She said, "You will eat nothing that has passed through this kitchen without my prior knowledge of it, my lord." He said, "I had assumed that was implicit." She said, "I prefer things stated plainly." There was a moment. It was the kind of moment that had no shape she could easily describe afterward. Not charged, exactly, in the way she might have expected, but waited. The kitchen was quiet around them, the banked fire giving off a low, consistent warmth, the smell of bread from that morning still faintly in the air. He was standing 4 feet from her, and he was looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for. He said, "I prefer things stated plainly as well." He left. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after his footstep had gone up the stair, and then she went and checked every lock on every cupboard herself before she went to bed. She had told herself clearly and firmly and more than once that she was not thinking about him in any way that was inadvisable. She was a practical woman. She had a practical understanding of where she stood in the arrangement of things, and she did not intend to cause herself unnecessary suffering by imagining away the facts of that arrangement. He was the Baron of Ashbourne. She was his cook. He had stood in her kitchen because he had needed someone whose ears he could trust, and she had been the person with the ears, and that was all. And she intended to keep it that way, in the privacy of her own mind, with considerable force of will. The bread the next morning was very good. She thought this was probably related. The man from outside the household arrived on the 7th day, in the form of a solicitor named Mr. Barr. Catesby ran forth, who was introduced to Lady Pembridge at luncheon as an old family friend, come to discuss some estate business. Nora watched him from the passageway as he greeted Lady Pembridge with the professional warmth of a man trained to give nothing away. She thought he was very good at his work. Lady Pembridge's face was harder to read than Mr. Pembridge's, which was its own information. She received the solicitor with perfect graciousness and said it was always a pleasure, and her hands remained perfectly still on the table, and her fan remained perfectly still in her hands, and she looked like a woman who was doing a great deal of quiet work beneath a perfectly still surface. That evening, the scene Nora had been expecting, without quite knowing she had been expecting it, arrived. Lady Pembridge came to the kitchen. In 11 years, this had never happened. Lady Pembridge was not a guest who descended to the domestic regions. She stood in the kitchen doorway in her silk, which was the deepest possible blue this evening, and looked at the space with an expression that was precisely calibrated between gracious condescension and the implication of something considerably less gracious. She said, "Mrs. Doyle, I wonder if I might have a word." Nora dried her hands and faced her. Lady Pembridge said still kindly that she had always had the highest respect for a woman of Nora's industry and reliability, and that she found it therefore all the more distressing to have to speak plainly. She said that the interruption at dinner had been damaging not only to the evening, but to Nora's own standing, and that she thought it only charitable to say that a continuation of this unfortunate attention to things that did not concern her could only result in the loss of her position. She said it as one woman to another. She said because she would not like to see a capable woman come to grief through an excess of imagination. She said with a small, warm, specific smile, "A kitchen maid imagines things. A cook who has been here 11 years is expected to know better." There it was. The label, the reduction, the polished reminder of everything that Nora was supposed to be and to have stayed. Nora said, "I understand you, Lady Pembridge." Lady Pembridge said, "I thought you might. You seem a sensible woman." She left. Nora stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides, and the fire going steadily in the grate, and the smell of the evening's meal in the air, and she thought, "She is frightened." That smile was the smile of a woman who was doing something because she was frightened, not because she was confident. She would not have come to the kitchen if she were still confident. She told the Baron the next morning. He was in the hall when she came out of the kitchen passage at 7 o'clock, dressed and already moving, and she stepped into his path without quite meaning to. He stopped. She was briefly aware of how close they were standing in the narrow passage, and of the particular way he went very still when she appeared, which she had stopped pretending she did not notice. She said Lady Pembridge came to the kitchen last night. He listened to the account with his eyes on her face. When she finished, he said, "She told you a kitchen maid imagines things." She said, "Yes, my lord." "Wah!" He said, "She said, 11 years in the same breath as kitchen maid." She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "I see." He did not move immediately. He stood in the passage with the particular quality of consideration she had come to recognize, and then he said quietly, "I am sorry." She was not entirely sure what to do with that either. The evening came. Mr. Rias. Renforth, the solicitor, had spent his day in the Baron's study with the door closed, emerging only for meals, at which he maintained his performance of a friendly social visit with complete conviction. Lady Pembridge watched him across the table with a pleasantness so relentless it had crossed some threshold into its opposite. Mr. Pembridge was very quiet again. He ate little. The confrontation, when it came in the drawing-room after dinner, and Nora heard it only in fragments, raised voices, a clarity of accusation, Lady Pembridge's voice losing its calibration and becoming something raw and less familiar. She heard the solicitor's voice, level and procedural. She heard the Baron's voice once, and only once, saying 4 words very clearly through the door. "I have the bag." After that, there was quiet. What happened in that drawing-room was pieced together afterward from Crofton, who was closest, and from Mrs. Graves, who heard more than she admitted. Mr. Renforth had produced in his measured solicitor's way a series of documents and a report from a physician he had brought with him from London, who had examined the contents of the bag and provided a written conclusion. He had also produced, with the care of a man laying out a very patient argument, a set of questions about the circumstances of Lady Clara Harcastle's death 3 years prior, that he indicated he intended to bring before the appropriate authorities. Lady Pembridge had not confessed. She had done something in some ways more revealing, which was that she had stopped speaking entirely, and that her hands had gone to her lap, and that the fan, for the first time in Nora's experience of her, had not moved. Mr. Pembridge, according to Crofton, had said nothing for a long time, and then had said one thing very quietly, which was that he was sorry, and that he had not known about Clara, that he had suspected the present but not the past, and that he was sorry. He said it to the Baron directly, and the Baron had looked at him for a long moment and had not yet answered. The arrangements that followed were legal and procedural, and not Nora's to know in their specifics. She knew that Lady Pembridge and Mr. Pembridge left Ashbourne Park the following morning. She knew that Mr. Renforth remained another 2 days. She knew that Mrs. Monners Graves, in the privacy of the still room with her ratafia, said that she had always thought there was something off about that woman, and said it in the particular way people spoke of having always thought things they had not, in fact, always thought. On the morning after the Pembridge's departure, the Baron came to the kitchen for the 3rd time. She was making bread. She was always making bread at that hour, and she did not stop when she heard his step on the stair, because she had learned by now that he did not require her to perform a cessation of work for his benefit, that what he required was considerably simpler than that. He stood in the kitchen. The fire was high and the room was warm, and the light was the particular yellow light of a late autumn morning coming through the small windows above the yard. He said, "It is concluded." She said, "I know, my lord." "I am glad." He was quiet for a moment. She worked the dough. He said, "Mr. Renforth will be returning to the matter of Clara's death." "It may take some time," she said. "Yes, my lord." He said, "I wanted to tell you before anyone else." She stopped working the dough. She did not mean to stop, it simply happened. He said, "I also wanted to say something that is not strictly the business of a household arrangement." He paused. The pause was not the pause of a man uncertain of what he wished to say, but of a man who had decided to say it and was choosing his words with the care they deserved. You came into a dining room full of people who had decided what you were, and you spoke. Anyway, you did not embellish. You did not excuse. You went on being exactly what you were, and knowing exactly what you knew, and the fact that it required any courage at all is one of the things about this household, and about me, that I will not forgive myself easily. She said, "You believed me, my lord." He said, "I was the only one in the room who ought to have already known to believe you, and I was still deciding. That is not a distinction I am proud of." She looked at him then, fully, because he was saying something that required being looked at fully. He said, "I find that I do not wish to arrange my household, going forward, in the way it has been arranged." He said it carefully, as he said everything. Not as a declaration, but as an honest statement of a position he had arrived at after consideration. "I find that I have been alone in this house for 3 years in a way that I had not intended to remedy, because I had decided, somewhere along the way, that remedying it was a thing I had forfeited the right to want. I am reconsidering that decision." The kitchen was very quiet. She said, "My lord." He said, "I am aware that what I am saying is irregular." She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "I am not asking anything of you today. I am telling you what I am thinking, because you prefer things stated plainly, and because you are the only person in this household who has earned the right to know what I am thinking, and because I have spent 11 years in a house where someone has been feeding me well and I have not, until this week, understood that the person doing it was also—" He stopped. He started again. That she was also worth knowing. She stood with the dough under her hands in the morning light in the windows, and the warm smell of bread and fire, and she thought, "This is either the most inadvisable moment of my life, or the most honest one, and it is possible it is both at once." She said, "I find, my lord, that I have also been reconsidering certain decisions." Something moved in his face that she had not seen there before. It was not a smile precisely, but it was in the general neighborhood of one, a small, careful, unguarded thing. The kind that arrived before a man remembered he was not the sort of person who showed those. He said, "Then, perhaps we might discuss it." She said, "Perhaps." He came to the kitchen again the following morning, and the morning after that. He came not to ask questions or to relay information, but simply to stand in the warm space of the kitchen for half an hour while Nora worked, and to speak when there was something worth saying, and to be quiet when there was not. She did not adjust her work to accommodate him. He did not seem to require her to. He drank the tea she put in front of him without ceremony, and watched her hands with the same gray, attentive gaze he brought to everything that mattered to him, and she discovered that being looked at in that way was something she had not known she wanted, until it arrived. By December, when the first snow came down over Ashbourne Park, and the kitchen garden went white, and the kitchen itself was the warmest room in the house, the arrangements had changed in several ways that Mrs. Bet. Graves described to Crofton as unprecedented in her 30 years of service, and that Crofton did not comment on because he was a young man with better judgment than his age might suggest. Nora did not move into the front of the house immediately. She would not be rushed, and he did not rush her, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He moved slowly, and he meant what he said, and he did not require her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. These were not small things. She had spent 11 years in a world that had decided what she was, and had no mechanism for revising that decision. And it turned out that a single man with gray eyes and a habit of standing still when something mattered could move more than a dining room full of people who had decided otherwise. He showed her the miniature of Clara one evening in December, when the fire was high and the snow was falling outside the window he had left uncurtained because she had once mentioned she liked to watch it. It was a small painting in an oval frame, a young woman with a pleasant face and a steady look. He held it for a long moment, and then put it down, and she put her hand briefly over his, where it rested on the table, and he turned his hand and held hers, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. By the following spring, when the kitchen garden came back, and Nora had begun to give the kitchen maid more of the daily management because she found she had other things to attend to in the mornings, the county had adjusted itself to the new arrangement in the way counties adjusted to things that were unprecedented, but also, in retrospect, entirely logical. Mrs. Graves said. She had always thought there was something there and meant it this time, and Crofton was promoted to a position that suited him better and had the grace to say nothing about any of it. The bread, by all accounts, remained excellent. On a morning in late March, when the light came through the kitchen windows in long, pale strips and the apple trees in the yard were beginning to show their first pale buds, Nora stood at the window for a moment before beginning the day's work and thought about a dining room and a soup tureen and a pair of hands going numb. She thought about what it meant that the only person in the room who had listened was also the person she had most feared telling. And she thought about the particular quality of a man who listened not because it was convenient, but because it was right, and because he preferred things stated plainly, and because he had decided, after 11 years of unknowing, that she was worth knowing. She turned back to the kitchen. The fire was already high because he had come down early and built it up without being asked, and she found, in the warm, particular light of that morning, that she did not need to say thank you, because he already knew, and she already knew he knew, and some things between people who preferred plainness